I think we stand here tonight after a month that has shaken us all to the core. Watching those images of insurrectionists in the Capitol, wandering the halls, bearing Confederate flags, has been very sharp and devastating to a lot of us. I think we're all wrestling with a lot of different questions right now. We're wrestling with, as a nation, whether we're fully committed to guaranteeing each and every American citizen can exercise their full constitutional rights. We're grappling with whether or not this episode reflects who we are as a nation. We're grappling with how to define a shared national identity that is not built on white supremacy. We're grappling with how to go forward. So while this panel is framed in terms of the early 20th century, it provides a really powerful lens to understand the world that we live in today and how we can begin to build the world we want to live in tomorrow. It's my great pleasure and my honor to introduce two fantastic panelists to guide us through the discussion this evening. We have with us Carrie Greenidge, who's the Andrew W. Mellon Assistant Professor of Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University. Carrie's the author of Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter, a fabulous and award-winning book. It covers African-American radical political thought in the early 20th century. We were honored that Carrie was one of our key scholarly advisors for the Reflecting Attucks exhibit. I'm also thrilled to welcome this evening Kiara Vigil, who's the Associate Professor of American Studies at Amherst College. Kiara is the author of Indigenous Intellectuals, Sovereignty, Citizenship, and the American Imagination, 1880 to 1930. The work looks at how leading Indigenous thinkers shaped debates about race and citizenship in the early 20th century. So welcome to both of you, and thank you for joining us today. So for all the participants, if you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the chat box, and don't forget to select all panelists and attendees so that we can see what you have to say. So I want to start by saying this panel is a continuation of our Reflecting Attucks exhibit. So we'd like to start by talking about Boston civil rights leader William Monroe Trotter, who drew on Attucks in 1915 to protest The Birth of a Nation, a then newly released racist film that glorified white Southern violence against formerly enslaved people at the end of the Civil War. That film led directly to the creation of the new KKK. So Carrie, as the definitive expert on William Monroe Trotter, can you give us a sketch of his life and talk a little bit about how you see him fitting into the larger trajectory of New England and American history?
Oh, well, sure. And thank you so much for Revolutionary Spaces and Kiara Vigil for having me speak, and particularly for everyone for coming. William Monroe Trotter was born in the book, I say, at the confluence of the legacy of the Civil War and the promise of Reconstruction, and the period of what a historian called the racial nadir of American race relations at the turn of the 20th century. He's born in 1872. He was born into relative privilege in Southern Ohio. His father was a lieutenant in the American Civil War. His mother came from a long history of conductors on the Underground Railroad, and Trotter himself attended Harvard University, graduated 1895, and was shocked by the ways in which, despite his background, despite his education, despite his degree, he could not find a job in anywhere in the United States except for in segregated institutions in the South. He was also shocked by the fact that what we now think of and what we now acknowledge as white supremacist violence, lynching, disenfranchisement of African-American voters, violent insurrections in state capitals across the South that overturned duly elected governments. All of that made Trotter very aware of the fact that African-American people, and indeed radical individuals, needed some type of press, some type of way to garner protest against the rise and tide of white supremacy, which was seen as the norm in 1901. He started his newspaper in 1901. It was called The Guardian. It was published in Boston. And through that, he really tried to resurrect this idea of radical Black abolition. And in his mind and in his roots in New England, he really looked at that as a Black-led movement against racial inequality and racial injustice. But he also also believed fundamentally that Blackness itself was this multiracial, multicultural identity, particularly in New England, where so many African Americans had ties to Native communities and communities across the diaspora. And so by the time we get to D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation, in 1915, the newspaper was 15 years old. It had really garnered a lot of attention across the radical Black Atlantic. So it was published in Boston, in New York, in the Caribbean. It was sold in Indian territory. It was sold in California. He really had garnered massive sort of working class people of color support for this idea that freedom was not just something that was a statement, it was something that had to be realized in upholding the Reconstruction Amendments. And D.W. Griffith's film, when it came out in 1915, was a film that was based on actually a book called The Klansman that was written directly to prop up, support, and glorify the rise of white supremacist violence in the aftermath of the Civil War. And The Klansman was a book that Trotter successfully got banned from public schools in Boston. And so by 1915, when D.W. Griffith turns The Klansman into a film, William Monroe Trotter was determined that the film should not be shown. And one of the things I say, and then I'll jump and leave it open for the next question, but one of the things I'll say is that Trotter's real focus was that, and this is what I argue in the book, was not about censorship. He was not arguing that nobody had a right to produce films that were distasteful to an audience. His argument was that this was not a film, that it was a work of political and racist propaganda, that it was designed to rally the white supremacist elements in the country and as well as in the federal government underneath the Wilson administration, and that it would lead to further violence against African Americans, but not just against African Americans, against anyone else who was considered a disenfranchised other within the United States. And so that was what his protest was based upon. And much in Trotter's life, he was pretty prescient. We know that what happened was that as a result of this film, in 1915, the new Ku Klux Klan was born. It was a Klan that had a very widespread appeal across the country, not just amongst former Confederates, but amongst people in Michigan, in New Hampshire, in parts of Massachusetts. Klansmen were elected to public office in Oregon, in Michigan, in Louisiana. And so this was what Trotter warned against when he tried to stage a protest against the film.
So, Kiara, could you talk a little bit also about ways in which other ways in which film was used to try to forge a national identity, because you've done work in that area too?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so in preparation for today's conversation, I just did a rescanning of what other films came out in 1915. And it turns out there were hundreds of other films that came out. And Birth of a Nation is an independent film, actually. So it's not a big studio picture. I think that's important to remember. There's actually all these other, and by big studio, 1915, there's no big studios the way we know them now, but there is the beginning of that. So there's the beginning of Fox and things like that. But you do have a lot of drama, a lot of romance, a lot of Westerns, which is my kind of area of investigation as someone who is trained in American studies and Native American Indigenous studies. I look at Westerns because Westerns are in many ways, before they were films, they were live action shows. Before that, they were dime novels and literary works, but they were, a uniquely American genre of trying to narrate our national identity and our nationhood, right? A way of thinking about who am I as a citizen of this place in relation to the landscape, and also de facto in relation to Indigenous people and manifest destiny, right? So I think most of us have seen a Western or know what a Western is, and usually know that it's a kind of good versus evil sort of thing. So it's interesting to think about how, in some ways, that genre is the original place where we have a pretense towards teaching, education, and kind of nonfiction representation of Western conquest, but always really in a celebratory, romanticized version of, cowboys and Indians fighting it out, right? Because in the end, we know who wins and we know who loses before we even watch the beginning of the film. So, I mean, that's, I think, an important context for thinking about the Birth of a Nation, that those are what's popular. That's actually what a lot of people want to see in the, silent film era. They're not they're not going to go and see A Birth of a Nation in the same way. I think it's right to think of it as more of a polemical piece. And so I was also looking at, okay, so what in terms of Indigenous studies might be an interesting analog to that? So in 1922, you have an acclaimed documentary, and I'm going to use that in quotation marks, Nanook of the North, made by Robert Flaherty. And it's really in quotation marks because it's really a fictionalized representation of a so-called vanishing race of Indigenous people in Canada, right? And there are actual Native people in their homes with their families there. And what's interesting is if you look at a book like Reservation Realism by Michelle Raheja, she's an Indigenous film studies scholar. She writes about how the people involved in the film, the Indigenous people, are really clever about trying to kind of subvert what the film is trying to do. The film's trying to create this romantic vanishing Indian tale, but they're doing all this subterfuge. So I think it's useful to think about that too, right? That when we talk about film, in a broad way, especially when there are people of color hired to, play all sorts of parts, they do have, I would say, constraints on them, but they also have some kind of agency in those roles to try to, subvert the dominant narrative that might be happening that they may not agree with, right? Because it's really a misrepresentation of either their culture or their understanding of the nation, and anything else. So it's interesting to kind of put that into our frame, I think, a little bit too, when we start to think about film and its power on audiences and what are they doing with the films that they watch and see. But in no way would I ever say that A Birth of a Nation was not responsible for the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. I think absolutely. And that's something to think about in that early 20th century moment, right? That white nationalism is eerily resonant with our current situation.
Yeah. So when you both think about the body of films that are there at that time, what would you say the key points that the filmmakers were trying to make were? What was the worldview that they were espousing at that time?
Kiara, would you like to take
Sure, I'll go first.
Call it out.
I think I want to say, to be fair, that in the early silent period, we do have a little bit more variation than what we have later, right? So at least in terms of the Western genre that I study, there are writers and directors and actors who try to do things with a little twist. Whoops, sorry, I'm in an automatic, ecologically friendly office. So there's a way in which, there are stories being told that are what we know as a celebration of American nationalism when it comes to settler colonialism and, kind of whitewashing of history and slavery and all of that. There's a lot of that happening. There are also some twists on that too, because and really in this period. So once we get into the 30s, 40s onward, there's a lot less of that. There's actually a kind of weirdly, the Western becomes a little bit more monolithic, and there's themes and motifs that repeat over and over again. I mean, anyone can kind of name them, like the saloon, the kind of woman of the night character, the drunken and lazy Mexican character. Basically what ends up happening is there's this, stereotyping of ethnicity or ethnic groups, right? And that helps to shore up a more white supremacist version of America and Americanness. And I think that's what's damaging and challenging about film early period, but then even as we go forward, we can just see more and more of that.
Yeah, and exactly what Kiara is saying, which is a great point. One of the things to realize about film as well is that it really emerges, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century, from this moment of American popular culture that was distinctly rooted in this idea of a vanishing Indian and in the idea of this Jim Crow Black character. So both of those things were well embedded in American popular culture when films were created. And so films often relied on that literature for their first iterations in the 1880s and 1890s. For instance, we have the Leatherstocking Tales that come out in the 1820s that kind of form this popular American literature. We then have the Jim Crow minstrel minstrel character that emerges by the 1830s, 1840s. And so those were what Americans, what was American popular culture. And there's been a lot of research done on, and scholarship written on that, how that drew Americans into this idea of what it meant to be American. So by the time you get into making films, those stereotypes, those images are very much embedded into popular culture, so much so that when African American and Native American performers themselves tried to take the stage, or were performers themselves, they had to reckon with the fact that that was where the audience and the popular culture was. And so one of the things about The Birth of a Nation that Trotter pointed out was that he had always been critical in The Guardian about popular culture, so much so that he lost a lot of revenue because he refused to use ads that denigrated, as he said, the people of colors of the world. So he would not include advertisements for things like the Nook of the North, advertisements for things like racist soap advertisements. He refused to put them in there because he said that part of creating this radical tradition was to sort of throw off these images of what he called the white man's reckoning of the Negro and the colored people. And so when he was approaching this notion of the birth of a nation, he was approaching it as a white supremacist specifically designed to denigrate, further marginalize, disenfranchise, and invoke violence against African Americans. But he especially, which was slightly different than a lot of his contemporaries, saw this as a project. I would argue, he argued it as a project that was this total system of white nation making in the early 20th century, and that white nation making was why this film was dangerous, was because it was not just an opinion, it was not just entertainment, it was a way in which all of these laws that had governed African Americans, Native Americans, 25 years after Wounded Knee, had governed them, it was justifying those laws. And so the image and the stereotype and the popular culture became the policy. And that was what sort of Trotter was very concerned with.
Yeah. So one of the things, when the three of us met to kind of do some prep work for this panel that we talked about that I thought was really interesting was how much these movements sit in the context of a larger transnational movement, both for Black and Indigenous peoples. So could you both speak a little bit to, for those of us who didn't already know, what was the transnational movement? How did it come to be? And why was it such an effective response at that particular moment?
Do you want to go first? I mean, I can say something quickly that I was thinking about in terms of, I feel like why 1915 is there this desire to make this polemical film? It could be, right? When people are afraid of racial mixing, it could be because it's happening. So in 1911, the Universal Racist Congress in London brought all these folks together from all around the world, right? So there was a panel from the United States. One of the people I write about in my book, Charles Eastman, a Dakota physician, a leading intellectual and progressive and kind of spokesperson for Indigenous people at the time. He was there on a panel with W.B. Du Bois and Franz Boas, and they were just having robust conversations about world peace, anti-war, interracial harmony. Mm-hmm. So one can imagine this is super scary and threatening, right, for other folks who might look at a particular world order and certain institutions in a way that's all about race and all about maintaining a hierarchy, one that we could point back to, the World's Fair in Chicago in like the 1890s and think about, what was that celebrating? And it was really celebrating a certain kind of white supremacist framework for understanding identity, nation building in the world. But by 1911, people are questioning that, politicians, academics, everyday folks are questioning that, and they're living it too, right? And in their marriages and in their relationships. And so to me, that's part of the backdrop here. Why are we making this film? We're making it because the opposite is happening and it's freaking us out.
Excellent. I think that's absolutely correct and absolutely a good point. It's 1915. We have to think that it's the beginning of war that's happening in Europe. So this whole notion of what does an empire, what does a colony mean, is really at the forefront of many people's minds. It's a moment when, particularly for across the African diaspora, you have all of this shifts between populations. So people from the Caribbean coming to the United States, people from the United States going to the Caribbean, people from the United States and Caribbean going to Europe and Africa. And so there's really, it's a moment of possibility that many, Indigenous and African American people saw. It was also a moment, particularly in the United States, in which so much of that possibility was constantly being squelched by sort of just horrendous violence that was happening at the turn of the century. You have in 1898, the sort of reminiscent of today, you have a duly elected mixed race government that's elected in North Carolina, and the white townspeople in Wilmington, North Carolina did not like that, and so they formed a coup. They sort of very similar to what happened a few weeks ago. They basically storm and say they do not recognize the government, and so the government was thrown out. It was a multiracial, biracial government in North Carolina in 1898, and white supremacists basically overthrew it. And as a result of that, North Carolina changed its voting laws, and African Americans in North Carolina were denied the right to vote until 1965. So it's sort of this moment where it's possibility. It's where people are really pushing it back against these racial norms and white supremacist ideals that are proliferating across the world. And there are many people pushing it back against that. And at the same time, you have this tremendous backlash against the people who are pushing against it. And so in terms of why 1915, and sort of the research that's been done on D.W. Griffith, D.W. Griffith was somebody who was that part of that white backlash, was really, really upset that the South had lost the war. It was in 50, 60 years. Was really upset at what he saw, this rising tide of color, which was kind of this notion, Madison Grant and these racial scientists and stuff. He really, really believed that the world, with racial mixing and with the specter of, darker races across the world, that it was really a danger to himself as a white male in the United States. And so it's this moment where all of that is coming to a head. But as Professor Vigil was saying, it would be remiss to say that somehow that element was not in reaction to the very real element of people fighting against this white supremacist world order.
Yeah. One of the things that we talk about in the exhibit a little bit is the Red Summer after World War I and the ways in which the returning African-American soldiers were treated. And sort of the assaults against their rights as citizens. So Carrie, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's a fascinating part of the exhibit and a really critical thing also to understand when we look at this period in early 20th century history.
Yeah, well, and thank you for the question. One of the things, 1919 is demobilization after World War I. African Americans had participated in World War I. The only group in the United States to participate out of their numbers in the whole population. So if the Black population was about 10%, 11%, their participation rates in the military was about 20% to 22%. So they participated out of their numbers that they actually were in the population. They also participated underneath a government, the Wilson administration, that had instituted segregation in the federal government, and Trotter was involved in confronting the president about that on 2 occasions. And so by the time you have the end of World War I, many African Americans, particularly radical African Americans like Trotter, were very much galvanized and inspired by what they had experienced in World War I. They were very much inspired by this whole notion that emerged through Wilson, ironically, of self-determination for people, and the fact that people should be able to decide how they are governed and who governs them. And so by the end of World War I, African Americans kind of have this shift, particularly many African Americans who experienced World War I. And there's stories of young African American soldiers really being reconceptualizing their role kind of in the world and in this notion of a democratic society. And on their way home, of course, there's also the backlash, as we just talked about, against this new idea. And so the Red Summer was a period of immense violence against African Americans across the country. Some of these African Americans still in uniform were attacked and lynched in Arkansas, for instance. the Black community holds a parade for returning veterans, and white supremacists attack the parade and lynch the two men still in uniform. So it's this intense moment of violence. And one of the ways in which this sort of relates to this memorialization of someone like a Crispus Attucks is that William Monroe Trotter was really adamant that the white supremacist argument that somehow Black people did not belong certain places was a fallacy, simply because how could you argue that if the first person to die at the Boston Massacre was a man of African and Native descent, right? That proves beyond a doubt that people of color, as we now say, have been here since the beginning, that they are often the first ones to sacrifice, just out of proportion to what they are in the population, sacrifice themselves for an ideal that often does not include them. And so he really linked the notion that Americans had forgotten that fact, that Native people and African people were here from the beginning. He equated that with this rise in violence, and that he would argue it was a fallacy for white people to be attacking African Americans, not just a fallacy, not just, violence and illegal and murder. It was also sort of holding up a myth that never actually existed, right? That you could not argue in 1919 that somehow this was new Black people fighting for their country, that in fact, Black and Native people had always been there, and in fact had always been there out of proportion to their numbers in the population. Trotter was, I sort of call him somebody who read a lot of history, particularly local history, and one of the things he always pointed out was that a good percentage of people who were the first for the Patriot cause, at least in New England, were people of what he called musty descent, and that was the term given to people of African descent and mixed Native American descent. So he was really adamant that the lie that the United States had at the time, and in some cases continues to this day, was not true, and that was, people knew it wasn't true, and that it was very easy to see that it wasn't true. And he writes these letters to people in newspapers who are saying, well, Crispus Attucks was not Black. There's one statement that, well, he couldn't have been Black or Native because neither of those races of people have given anything to Anglo-Saxon civilization, right? And Trotter writing a letter back that says, that's not, the historical record, the historical context, and we should not have to justify our presence here. So in terms of, that's kind of a long answer, but in terms of the Red Summer of 1919, it really becomes a reckoning for this notion that somehow African-American people, people of color, don't belong, right? If that's the statement that people are saying in 1919, Trotter comes back and says, actually, no, we have been here longer than many people have, right? If you are part Native descent, and he pointed to the fact that many African Americans in Boston at the time were, right? You have been here longer than, the Europeans who settled here. And so to have this conversation, we need to throw that out of the conversation, Trotter would say, and have a conversation about why it is that we can't accept our history.
And just to add a point of connection that might be helpful for people who don't know, what Carrie was talking about the disproportionate service record, right? So Native American soldiers incredibly disproportionately in terms of their population represented in the military, including World War I. More than 12,000 Native American soldiers fought in World War I, right? And what's useful about that is that these are people who didn't actually have the same rights as the other people who were fighting with, right? So it wasn't until 1924 with the Indian Citizenship Act where all Native Americans actually have suffrage, right? They can't even vote, but they're fighting for their country or countries, because most of them see themselves as kind of having dual nation, kind of citizenship, right? But they're doing that, and they're honoring, the United States, but they're not getting there's no quid pro quo, And so I think it's useful to put that in this context, especially when we start to have these questions about, well, who's legitimate, right? In terms of, their claim to the nation, but who's serving the nation and in what way, so another piece of the puzzle.
So one of the things that I feel like is, again, resonant from that historical moment to today is I think there's a lot of people struggling with the question of how radical should one be in the face of a situation that feels really intractable. So can you both talk a little bit about the different radical versus reformist schools at this time, And to what extent do you see us continuing that conversation today, or has it changed in a profoundly different way?
Well, just in terms of Trotter himself, the reason why I refer to him as a Black radical is because by the time throughout his life, he sort of vacillated between merely arguing that the United States had to live up to the promises made in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, to really having this notion that those amendments themselves could only be enacted if Black people themselves were deciding the terms under which they were enacted. So he was really a big believer that, you know, people should not be led by kind of white reformers or white do-gooders or people who were kind of on a liberal spectrum, that people, the communities themselves had to decide how it was they were going to formulate their own forms of justice. And so in that he was definitely somebody who was a radical, although as a radical, he did acknowledge that you had to work at certain points within the system that existed. He would point to the fact that African Americans in Massachusetts at the time were a small number, but they were swing voters. So if elections were very, very close and 3,000 Black people voted in the state of Massachusetts, say in 1904 or 1908, they could turn around local elections. They could turn around and decide zoning policies. They could turn around and decide the way banks and the state responded to, labor protests. And so he really said, well, that then is why we should vote, right? Is because just immediately we can have an immediate effect on ourselves and our lives, even if we can't affect what's happening throughout the nation. He also would advocate, though, that if you are denied the right to vote, which, and this was at a time where disfranchisement was at an all-time high, and by 1960, we know that 85% of all eligible Black voters in the country were denied the right to vote through things like grandfather clauses and violence and all that type of stuff. He would say that then you had to take matters into your own hands and seize your rights that were given to you as a human being. So to answer your question, I mean, I think that we're in a moment where I think people need to reevaluate this notion that reform and radicalism have always been in contest with each other, and really look at it as that they are in conversation with each other. And the only way that we've ever had any transformational justice in this country, or I would say sort of just generally, is when that tension is its most intense. That's an opportunity where reformers can work in the law and change laws and, executive actions that have gone through the Biden administration and passing laws and all these things. That's a reformist agenda. But that could not happen if you did not have radicals on the ground. Like, nobody would be talking about the new Green New Deal if you didn't have radical, environmentalists on the ground pushing what this looks like, right? So those are radicals, but then the reform itself is happening through the law. So I think that Trotter was somebody who really struggled with that towards the end of his life, as I think many good radical activists often do, which is that he really believed by the end of his life that you really need to take and ally with radical elements as opposed to relying more heavily on reformists. But he was somebody who, throughout his life, all of his radical steps led to reform, even though if it led to reform after he was gone, right? So one of the things he argued was, an 8-hour workday. Who would have thought it, right? That was a very radical idea at the time. And, people should have the right to have a fair wage, right? And he's accused of aligning with communists and socialists. And he did ally with those people. But by the 1920s and 30s, that becomes reform legislation. And we can have a whole conversation about how that's weakened and stuff in terms of reform. But it then becomes part of the conversation. So I think at the moment, for those of us who are feeling despair at the moment, and this isn't kind of to have platitudes about stuff or anything, and I'm definitely one of those people as well, but it is to say, that to recognize that radicalism and that reformism have always been in conversation and in tension with one another, right? And so it's not a matter, I believe, of saying, no, we have to get rid of reform or we have to get rid of radical. It's saying that both of those things have to happen in order for there to be any kind of radical change to the status quo.
I love the way that you framed that, and I think it makes so much sense to think about terms that we might use and that we're trying to put on people in the past and say, well, do they fit into this category? When people are so complicated and often fraught and full of contradiction, and that, you know, someone like Trotter can even evolve into a position that maybe he wouldn't have supported earlier on in his life, right? And I certainly have seen that with Charles Eastman, who I mentioned earlier, who, you know, back in the late 19th century, he had a very unpopular position of supporting allotment and the Dawes Act, right? You know, which here we are in Massachusetts. So Senator from Massachusetts, Senator wanted to take tribally, collectively owned land and break it up and allot it to individual heads of household. When you do that, then you have leftover land that can be sold to speculators and to settlers. And Eastman, at the moment and during that time, supported this because he saw in it, in the way that kind of agenda or law or policy was being written, language about inclusion into the nation, getting to have, you know, the vote, basically a way of uplifting Indigenous people, you know. And so he was focused on that without really seeing the downside. And later on, he regretted that position and didn't feel that way anymore, and was much more critical of settler colonial policies like allotment, and became, you know, really more outspoken against capitalism, against even Christianity. And he himself, you know, was a practicing Christian and Dakota, right? And I think that's exactly that interesting kind of contradiction we might see, you know. Certainly within Native studies, I think there was a long time where people wouldn't study Charles Eastman or look at that period, because he and the other quote unquote red progressives of the early 20th century, people who were trying to use reform, who were trying to work within the tools of the federal government or even the Bureau of Indian Affairs, those folks were looked down upon as not radical enough, right? Yeah. But in fact, they had commitments on the ground that were quite radical. They had positions and ideologies that were quite radical, but they were trying to maneuver within what Kevin Neal, who's a political scientist, describes as the third space of sovereignty. They had to kind of work between the lines of the U.S. kind of the U.S. nation's way of constraining their movements, whether through policy and like voting or other kind of economic means, right? Or even through the lens of culture. You know, you think about how radical it could be to be in an interracial marriage, which Charles Eastman was, to raise his daughters, which he did. I'm in Amherst right now, and that's where they lived a lot of the time. One of his daughters went to Mount Holyoke down the road from here. And there's a lot that's radical actually about what he and his wife were doing, though we may not see it from our vantage point in the 21st century, it certainly was, you know, in that time. And so I love this idea of thinking about reformist agendas and radical agendas really in conversation and operating with either within an individual or within an organization, you know, with a lot of complexity. You know, why would we ever think that people in the past would be easy to understand? Not easy to understand today.
Exactly.
So I want to take a few questions from the very busy chat. So thank you all for weighing in. So there's a couple questions in here I'm going to direct to Carrie, where people are looking for a little bit more about details for the protest for Birth of a Nation. And one of the specific questions relates to whether or not a stink bomb was actually used.
Yes. So
tell us more.
Okay, so when Birth of a Nation came out, Trotter by that time was infamous for forming mass radical protests. So his strategy was to get as many, as he called them, the genteel poor colored folk from across New England to gather in one space and basically put the pressure on whatever they were mobilizing against. And he started this as early as 1902. And so by 1915, he had that infrastructure across New England and across the area where he would, through his National Equal Rights League and through the Guardian, mobilize ministers, community leaders to bring people on the T, basically, to wherever he wanted them to go to make their protest. So when Birth of a Nation came out, he had that at his disposal. And he actually came in conflict with the NAACP. So the NAACP had a parallel protest, but the NAACP did not want to use mass action. They were really, we're going to use the courts, we're going to go directly to Mayor Curley, and we're going to talk about the film, and we're going to, there was even like these efforts to create an NAACP film that would contradict the W. Griffith's film. And so Trotter's real style was that, no, we're going to show up and we're going to demand that the film itself be taken down. And they do this at a time when, if we think of the way the film appeared in Boston, when the film opened, people actually walked up and down Tremont Street dressed in Ku Klux Klan gear to announce that the film was there. And so this sort of caused people to come and kind of take on the role of the KKK, which was reforming in the South, and kind of parade through Boston Common and think it was funny, right? That they were kind of imitating the film. And so Trotter, in doing that, having those black bodies like kind of just in the way, was a very radical act, right? And having people show up at the film, and when the lights went down, throw rotten eggs and throw stink bombs, anything to disturb the film. And he really did that because he argued that it was disrupting what people thought of as kind of popular entertainment as usual, right? Sort of the idea that good Bostonians could kind of still go see the film, but you were yet having this conversation about why it wasn't right. And then you could also have then a conversation with the mayor, and he would decide. And so Trotter was saying that wasn't the way to go. This was actually a serious violation of kind of the cultural and political contract in the country, and you had to have people go in and disturb it. So yes, he set off stink bombs. 2 of his supporters were arrested and charged with disturbing the peace. Trotter himself was arrested and charged with disturbing the peace. But he, as happened multiple times in his life, but he really argued that this was the point, right? You had to be in the space where the injustice was happening in order to call attention to the injustice.
And I could just add to that, what's interesting is that a kind of what we could call a less radical approach. I think it was believed as 1911, a delegation of Ojibwe folks traveled from the Great Lakes down to Washington, D.C. to try to have a meeting with the president and also Congress to protest how they were being misrepresented in a Western film. So there were Native people who were going to see films and seeing things that they found incredibly offensive and derogatory, and just this savagery that was happening. And they were thinking about, how do we make our dissent, our protest, visible to people? And that was their tactic, right? Which is really interesting to kind of think about, based off of our previous conversation about reform versus radical.
Yep.
So kind of building off of that, one of the other questions that popped up in the chat was, are there any lessons we can use from Trotter's effort to get the Birth of a Nation banned that we can in the 21st century use to battle racism?
Well, I think there's multiple. I think one of the things is to look at Trotter's battle against Birth of a Nation within a context of his battle against a lot of things during the time period. He really didn't see it as, I'm battling the Birth of a Nation. If the best things happens and the film is banned, then that's the end of the fight. He was really somebody who was concerned with constantly, his famous statement was agitate, 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 which he borrowed from, reformers from the early 19th century. And he really believed that that was the key to having a, just society. And so, as far as taking lessons from the past, I think that the biggest thing to take from someone like a Trotter or somebody like the activists who were around during that turn of the century period is that, justice doesn't come from passing one law or one moment where you're victorious or you appear to be victorious, right? And then everyone just goes home, right? It's this constant battle because, as Kiara was just saying, like the terms of the battle are constantly changing. So, when Charles Eastman is living in Amherst, it is a radical act to be in an interracial marriage and have your children attend, one of the foremost women's institutions in the country at the time. It was a radical act for Trotter to argue that no, Black people should be able to go to Harvard and Yale as well as to manual training schools, and it shouldn't be a controversy, right? They deserve to have both, right? That both of those things are radical in their time, and then the radical kind of then continues to be radical by shifting as the times change. So I think to answer your question, I think that we need to take lessons from constantly re-upping the response to the injustices that exist, because for every time people beat an injustice, the people who are doing the injustice just kind of change the terms, right? And that's just the way it's been, right? Native American people finally get citizenship in 1924, but then what does this mean in terms of tribal rights and sovereign rights going forward, right? So yay for citizenship rights, but what happens then after, right? Yay, Black people by 1917, the Supreme Court rules that, you can't have restrictive covenants in real estate, but what does that really mean if there's no mechanism to enact that, right? You then need the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act in the 60s. And even then you have problems. So it's every generation, you know, as Trotter would say, agitate for, in a very serious way, even as change appears to be happening.
So another question that popped up in the chat was, how much does this movement in American culture connect also to the rising anti-immigrant fervor that came to a head in the 20s?
Oh, well, in terms of Trotter, so Trotter had a sometime relationship with Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the white supremacist senator from Massachusetts, who was one of the people to support the National Origins Act, which was passed in 1924, which restricted immigration from undesirable countries. So there was a quota system enacted in 1924, which argued there were certain races, and I put that in quotes because the concept of race was as it was at the time. Those included people from Southern and Eastern Europe, people who were from Asia, all of Asia, people from Africa, and people from the Caribbean. And so it was part of the same movement. But I will say that Trotter's was very much allied with both the Jewish community in Boston and New England and with the Caribbean community, which was migrating here. And so Boston had a very vibrant Caribbean, many of whom were very politically radical, who migrated between 1890 and 1920. And by 1924, when that ruling happened, it really changed the face of a city like Boston that had an influx of Black people from the Caribbean, right? And did not necessarily have as big of an influx of Black people from the South. And so what happened was then the Black population in Massachusetts stagnated compared to other places like New York City and Detroit, and didn't really start to rise again until after the 1960s, when that restriction was lifted. So it did have a big effect just in terms of demographics, in terms of the feel of the city. And Trotter would talk about that a lot. He sort of blamed the passage of that National Origins Act on, you know, the fear of white Anglo-Saxonhood in Massachusetts, right? And sort of trying to like stem the tide of how the state was changing up until 1924.
I mean, I can only add that I think the example of Boston is useful to think about how patterns of immigration are really specific to geography, right? And so, you know, depending on where you are in the United States and who's moving in and out, these questions about, you know, how people are interacting and how they're being oppressed or kind of, you know, misunderstood and categorized in a way that's oppressive, it will differ a little bit. And one of the other people that I write about in Indigenous intellectuals is Carlos Montezuma, who's a Native physician living in Chicago during the 1920s. And, you know, immigration in Chicago is super different, right, than Boston. Certainly for African Americans it is, but also I think for people from all different countries. And so these questions, so Carlos Montezuma writes about this a lot. He publishes his own newsletter called Wasaja that he circulates and sends to Indian country and to all sorts of people, you know, non-Native people across the United States. And some of the really robust editorial pieces that he himself writes draw connections between how immigrants are being basically abused, right, by the federal government, and how, oh, well, this is what they've always done to us, right, Native people, you know. And there's a lot of Indigenous scholarship about this, and there's actually a book by Jace Weaver about the in the coal mine, right? So like people, when it comes to policies that restrict people's movements, policies about voting or, you know, not getting to vote, you know, the way that different populations who are in the minority are being controlled by the majority population, we can look to the case of Native people often as this is the warning bell of what will happen later to other groups, right? So I think there is that awareness in terms of Native people themselves in the 1920s. They know that history, they viscerally, but they know it intellectually, and they do draw a sense of solidarity, I would say, with other groups that they are now seeing having similar experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So as our time draws to a close, I wanted to ask you both a sort of a parting question. What do you think Attucks can mean for us today? What lessons does he have to offer at this particular moment?
I mean, I'm tempted to say that part of what he offers, and I'm kind of thinking about how close we are to the inauguration, and also the insurrection against the Capitol. But, you know, part of what he offers is a reminder about, you know, the multiplicity of people who are here, who have always been here, and who, you know, by recognizing that and trying to understand that, we can reshape and reframe what this moment might mean, you know? And I mean, I told you both, I wrote this piece about Charles Curtis, who is this first vice president of color, right? So before Kamala Harris, and that was in the 1920s with Herbert Hoover, which is really interesting to think about. Yeah. President like Herbert Hoover had a Native American vice president. But what does that tell us, right? That happened, right, in the 1920s. So, you know, I think there may be more points of continuity that are actually positive for us than negative, you know, when we start to look back to the past and think about where we are now.
Yes, well said. I would also say, I think Crispus Attucks teaches us and tells us that the stories we're told about America and American exceptionalism and who is here and who matters is never correct, right? Really, you know, we have to sort of dig in and not assume that it's the story that we've been told, or even the story that, you know, certain people were trying to make as part of the history standards in the United States. You know, that's a myth, and really understanding why and dissecting how that myth is created, and it's a choice to kind of believe that myth is true. And so I think Crispus Attucks is just an example of how that. You know, that the myths that we tell ourselves about the United States, that we assume, that we can never assume that those are true, right? And what we're told about what the U.S. is as a concept, as a nation state, or even the very idea of a nation state, right, is not what we've been told that it is.
Yeah. Any final parting thoughts that we didn't talk about? I think we've covered
a million things.
So many things. I wish we could go on forever, but we are coming down to the end of the time. So I just want to thank you both for joining this session today. It's been fantastic to talk things through, particularly, as I said before, at this moment in time when it feels good to kind of honestly own and confront some of the most challenging moments in our nation's history, to understand that this place that we're in right now is unfortunately familiar territory, but we can learn from the past in order to try to navigate the present moment. If you liked today's panel, please do follow us on at Rep Spaces on all the social media channels, or sign up for our newsletters. We do have some great programs coming up that we'll be announcing in the coming weeks. So we hope you stay in touch with us, and thank you again for coming.